Hello, my name is Ice Cold, and I am here to read the second chapter of Dan versus the Magic of Friendship, Season 1, written by Barry Broadcaster. As always, our faithful recorder is Nightshade, also called Chris. Twilight and Spike explained what happened in the Crystal Empire to their three guests. Chrysalis and Fluffy listened intently, hanging on to the two's every word as they detailed their last adventure. Dan sat with arms folded, still angry at the fact that he'd been left behind. Well, that's fantastic, Dan yelled sarcastically. Once again, you went off on some magical question you neglected to tell me. You always do this to me. You take off all of your friends and you leave me here all alone. Dan, I'm really sorry, Twilight said. But I did tell Flufflepuff we were leaving. And you expected her to tell me? Flufflepuff sat beside him, staring into blank space with her tongue out. She occasionally when someone finished a comment. Spike shrugged. I left her a note. Dan turned to the pink ball. You had a note all along and you didn't give it to me? Fluffle again in response. Well, where is it? Dan demanded. A paper airplane shot out of Fluffle's fluff. Dan grabbed it. Dear Dan, he read, Spike and I are going to. He trailed off as his voice fading slowly. Frowning, he crumpled the paper and stood up. That does it. I'm out, Dan said, his voice flat with apathy and discontent. He walked towards the door. Dan, wait, Spike said as Dan walked past him. You don't have to leave, he huffed. I'm not sticking around where I'm not appreciated. But Dan, Twilight trailed off. It was very clear the man intended to leave. Where are you going to go? I don't know. Someplace where I feel welcome, I guess. He opened the door to Twilight's house and was greeted by the cold night air and stars of the dark sky above. Don't do this, Dan, Twilight pleaded. We're still friends. Dan turned at that comment. Friends? You spend more time with your 5 other friends than you do with me, and I live in the same house as you. Well, hey, I live here too, Spike defended. Just because I don't have an element of harmony and I'm not a pony doesn't mean I deserve to be left behind while you're out saving the world. Twilight stopped at thought. She did tend to leave Dan alone when she was doing things with her other friends. She looked over at Spike, who was casting an innocent glance at her. Dan wasn't the only one. Where are you going to go? Twilight asked. I'm going home. Back where my friends actually bother to keep me in the loop. Back to Earth? Twilight asked. Dan hadn't spoken much about his home since he showed up. Twilight still had no idea how to travel to another dimension was even possible. Yes, Earth! Dan shouted. Not like I have any other choice. Back to my studio apartment. North Hollywood. His voice became laced with venom as he mentioned his home. But at least there I'm not completely ignored. How are you going to get back home? Spike asked. He scratched his chin with his claw. In fact, you never even told us how you got here. Dan turned around slowly. Teeth gritted and closed the door. Oh, so you want to know about me now? How I got here? Spike and Twilight exchanged glances. Yeah, if you don't mind. All right, fine. I'll tell you how I wound up in Equestria. But then I'm gone, he declared. All right, Dan. Twilight nodded in agreement. Dan walked into the center of the living room. Thinking back, it was a day like any other day, he began. Twilight and Spike took eager seats on the floor. Flufflepuff and Chrysalis also appeared from the kitchen and took positions nearby to listen. Individual bags of popcorn sprouted out of Flufflepuff's utility fluff. Spike grabbed one and proceeded to indulge while paying attention. Transatlantic flight random made-up number. Somewhere over the Pacific. Attention passengers, this is your captain speaking, the voice from the intercom said. On behalf of Transtolerable Airwaves, I'd like to apologize for a slight navigational error. We should be arriving at St. Gary's Mart International in another 3 hours. The passengers in the cabin emitted an anonymous groan. Slight navigational error was an understatement. The pilot was obviously using this term to describe the fact that he missed the approach to St. Gary's Mart Airport and would have ended up taking the flight all the way to Japan if the flight attendant had said something. Flight random made-up number was originally supposed to be a short couple of hours from northern Canada back to California. Now, somewhere over the Pacific, the passengers were beginning to get agitated. Dan, Chris, and Elise were not pleased as they had to continue sitting in the cramped middle aisle of the coach section of the plane. Recently, the coach section had been renamed the convenience section as to avoid negative connotations. I don't believe this, Dan grumbled. How does a plane miss where it's supposed to land? Dan's friend Chris, sitting next to him, shrugged. Maybe it's his first time in the area and he got lost. Dan paused for a moment, processing the suggestion and questioning his friend's intelligence. He's a pilot! How did he get lost in the sky? Did you forget which way is up? If there's a problem with the instrument, it's actually very easy to lose your sense of direction while flying, Chris' wife Elise mentioned. So what is he going to do? Stop and ask for directions? Stan shouted. A flight attendant passed by them. Should I draw him a map? Go up to the cockpit, point over his shoulder and say, Hey genius, that's California! Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain seated, she instructed him. I am seated! Dan raised his voice in anger. What was wrong with this airline? Sir, I'm asking you to remain seated, the attendant repeated. Dan said nothing back. His eyelid twitched, and he gestured to his seated position with both hands. Very good, sir. The attendant continued walking past. The intercom crackled. Attention passengers, we're ready to begin our in-flight movie, Revenge of the Nerds. Dan's attitude changed immediately. Oh, this might not supposed to be a bad flight after all. Did you guys hear what movie they're showing? He said enthusiastically. Revenge of the Nerds? You actually liked that movie, Dan? Elise asked. Why wouldn't I? It's classic. Comedy gold. The acting in it is fantastic and the characters are amazing. I especially love the guy who plays Booger. The rest of this flight might not be so bad after all. Elise raised an eyebrow at Dan but didn't say anything else. At the front of the cabin, the flight attendant pulled down the screen for the film. Just when it reached the bottom, it snapped and rolled back up. She reached up to the grab and pulled it down again once more. It snapped and rolled back up. At the edge of the center aisle, Dan watched in frustration as the attendant struggled with the projector screen. Finally, she pulled out some duct tape and taped the projector down. Dan was relieved. The woman then got on her own private intercom and addressed the passengers in convenience class. Dan grumbled in his seat, growling like an enraged animal. Sir, a flight attendant stopped by him. I'm going to have to ask you to remain seated. That didn't make any sense. But I am seated! I can't not remain seated! The flight attendant looked down at him. Sir, she said in a sterner voice, I'm asking you to remain seated. What did that even mean? You're not making any sense! I'd have to stand in order to not remain seated and do not raise your voice at me, sir. You'd better calm down, Dan, Chris cautioned him. Was he supporting this nonsense? Teeth gritted, hands balled. Dan gestured back to his seated position as he shook with anger and said nothing. The flight attendant hovered over him for a few uncomfortably quiet seconds. Very good, sir, she said and went off. The other flight attendant at the front of the cabin returned back from her station. She began. We only have one copy of the Revenge of the Nerds on this flight. So the the luxury class passengers are going to be watching that. So we don't even get the movie? Dan shouted again. A good portion of the cabin erupted in indignant outcries. The attendant held up a hand. Now hold on. We do happen to have another in-flight movie for this cabin. Chris smiled. You hear that, Dan? They do have a movie for us. It's not going to be that bad. So for the viewing pleasure of all those in coach, whatever. It's Biodome with Pauly Shore. The flight attendant held up the movie. Dan turned to Chris slowly, his rage building up again. You were saying? What am I going to do for 3 whole hours? How could this possibly get any worse? But the good news is, it's on Blu-ray with 90 extra minutes of bonus feature. Yet another uproar of dissatisfied groans was emitted from the passengers. The duct tape holding the screen down let loose, and the screen rolled up again. This is fantastic, Dan said sarcastically. He leaned his head out into the aisle to try and see into the first-class cabin ahead of them. For a brief moment he saw the corner of the first-class screen, only because it was so massive it took up most of the wall it was over. Another flight attendant closed the dividing curtain as she passed. Dan balled his hands into fists, then leaned forward and grasped them behind his head. I just want to get back to my apartment. I hope Mr. Mumbles is okay. She gets so lonely when I leave her for long trips. I thought you got kicked out of your apartment, Chris said. Wait, Elise interrupted. You got kicked out of your apartment? When did that happen? Last week, Chris answered. Dan had a little problem with management at his apartment building. I was sick and tired of the vending machine at my apartment complex being out of order all the time, Dan began. Despite multiple complaints and recommendations that it should be fixed in the complex suggestion box, it remained broken. So I did the only logical thing anyone in my situation would do. He stuffed the vending machine into the suggestion box, Chris revealed. That was my suggestion, Dan justified. It wouldn't fit though. Chris nodded. So he hit it with an aluminium bat repeatedly and left it on top of the suggestion box in the main office. How did they find out it was Dan? Alice asked. There were security cameras set up in the office. Dan turned away, as Chris explained. They installed them because someone made a recommendation in the suggestion box. I just want to get back home, Dan whined. He covered his face with his hands in despair. Chris put a comforting hand on Dan's shoulder. We'll be home soon, Dan. Why don't you read a magazine or something? With a heavy sigh, Dan slowly picked his head up. Looking forward, he grabbed one of the in-flight magazines from the couch in front of him. What other choice did he have? He tried to open the small brush-sized piece of reading material to find the pages were stuck together. Placing his fingers on the edge, he tried to pry them apart. The magazine ripped along the insides, rendering both pages illegible. Dan's eyelid began twitching. That does it! That does it! He began shaking with rage. He placed his hands on the center of the magazine's weak binding and tore it in half, then tore it again, ripping it to shreds. Sir, a flight attendant practically materialized next to him. I'm going to have to ask you to remain seated. Dan turned to her, exasperated. But I am, sir, she said in a tone of sterner tone. I'm asking you to remain. Grrr! He growled at the woman, about to explode. Chris grabbed him by the shoulder again. Dan, take it easy. Practically foaming at the mouth, entire body vibrating with a toxic anger, Dan suddenly snapped. He realized there was nothing he could do to make the flight get to the destination faster. He was just going to have to deal with it. Releasing a slow breath, he turned to the flight attendant. Can I get up to use the restroom, please? The flight attendant nodded. Of course, sir. It's at the back of the cabin next to the emergency exit. Thank you. Dan smiled and rose up from his seat. Back in a minute, guys, he told Chris and Elise. Dan walked to the back of the plane, feeling a little bit better just accepting his circumstances. He noticed the other passengers, some grumbling just like he had been. Dan would have still been just as angry as they had been, but he reminded himself that soon they would be back at the airport and he would be home. Of course, what passed for home right now was his car. He didn't really have to use the bathroom at the moment, but sitting somewhere quiet for a few minutes would give him some time to center himself and relax, and plot his revenge on the airlines. Yes, he couldn't do anything at the moment, but when the plane landed, Dan was already devising a plan to make sure the pilot never got lost again. Which is why he was taking the Rune magazine with him to the bathroom. He was going to draw the pilot a map straight to California in whatever crude fashion he could manage. And then he would forcibly tape it to the pilot's instruments along with his opinion of the airline. He reached the back of the plane and saw the restroom right next to the emergency exit. He thought it was somewhat odd. Someone could very easily mistake one for the other if they weren't careful. While the emergency exit door was clearly marked and the handle and the surface were differently designed, they were right side by side. It would be something else he would bring to the airline's attention one way or another. Dan placed his hand on the door to the restroom, clearly marked by a sign that read lavatory. He turned the handle and opened the door. Dan then noticed something very odd about the restroom. Specifically, there wasn't one on this flight. Or if there was, he didn't see it. He clearly remembered the sign on the door indicating it was a restroom, but now the door was flying off into the distance, jettisoned off the plane. But now he stared off into the open sky before him, unsure of what to do next. The realization then hit him. The airlines had labeled the doors incorrectly and he had opened the emergency exit by mistake. All of this happened in the fractions of seconds, and the shock didn't really hit Dan until he had already been sucked out of the cabin. Those idiots! Dan said, falling. I can't believe they mixed up the bathroom with the emergency exit. Someone should do something about that before somebody gets... His eyes went wide as he trailed off. Falling on his back, he saw the plane fly away in the distance. In midair, he turned himself around so he faced the surface as he plunged towards it. Underneath him, expanding in all directions, was the Pacific. Nothing but blue as far as the eye could see. And that is when the shark hit him. Ah! Dan screamed as he fell. Back on the plane, the cabin had already been repressurized. Sorry for the unexpected turbulence, folks, the captain said over the intercom. We're about ready to begin our final approach into St. Gary's Mott International. We thank you for flying Trans-Tolerable Airlines. Dan continued to scream until his lungs got tired. The surface of the sea came closer and closer to him, threatening to rush up to him as he descended rapidly. He spread his arms and legs out, slowing his descent. Not that he knew that would help. He was terrified. Heart racing, his mind began to drift back into his memories. All the good times and bad he shared with Chris and Elise. All the joys and sorrows. His precious pet cat, Mr. Mumbles. His car. Dan regretted that he would never get to see them again. But more than anything, he regretted that he could never get revenge on the various people that had wronged him. Dan realized immediately that he would not survive the fall. Carefully, he grabbed his cell phone from his back pocket. Dear Chris and Elise, Dan typed into a text message as his eyes began to water. As his last act, he planned on sending Chris a text detailing all the people, places, and things that had caused him injustice in the past, along with a list explaining what he wanted to happen to each of them. When he was done, he hit send. The phone bleeped in an error message. 2 bars? Cheap piece of junk! When I get my hands on the manufacturer, I'll wring his neck! Just then, Dan realized the validity of the statement he just made. Once again, a pang of regret hit him as he fell. He wouldn't be able to exact revenge upon the cell phone company. He opened the unfinished text on his phone and added the phone's manufacturer to the list. Dan watched the surface of the ocean continue growing closer as he plummeted. Slowly, he saw a white, puffy cloud edge closer into view below him. The cloud soon blocked his view of the ocean, and he realized that he was going to fall right through it. He raised his hands to cover his face as he passed through the white vapor. For a brief moment, Dan was blinded. He couldn't see out of the whiteness of the cloud, and it enveloped him entirely. He could still feel that he was falling low, and the wind whipped around him. Quickly it ended, and he was able to see again. Looking down, Dan noticed a change in the surface of the ocean. Specifically, the ocean was gone. Stretching out before him now was land, a rolling sea of dark greens and browns. The entire landscape of the world had changed. What had happened? Moments ago he'd been staring at the expanse of the sea, and now it looked like he was over the mainland. Examining the entire world around him, he could make out forests, mountains in the distance, even roads. Below him and coming in the distance, he could make out more clouds, only denser than once before. He could see figures darting about them, like giant birds. All of these strange new phenomena didn't make sense to Dan, but they also didn't change the fact that he was falling before the chute. He screamed again. What is this? What happened? Where am I? Dan yelled. He held a cell phone and tried to use the camera on it, but nothing else, not knowing what else to do. Hey buddy, a voice said to him. I think you might need some help. Dan looked up. Staring back at him as if it was... Well, he didn't know what it was. If he had to guess, it looked like some kind of sky blue horse with wings. Like a pony. A Pegasus pony. You okay? Where's your wings? Do you know magic? Wings? Magic? Dan shouted back. I don't know any magic! And why should I have wings? The creature looked puzzled. Why would you be flying without wings or magic? I'm not flying! I'm falling! Oh, the blue creature said, understanding. She stopped flying alongside him and he shot past her, continuing to his rapid descent onto the surface. Ah! Dan screamed again, not knowing what else to do. He tumbled as he fell until he was able to straighten himself out. The surface began getting closer and closer. A dark green forest came into view as he plummeted. It looked to be where he would be landing. Dan's heart began to race. Nervous fear rose in his throat. Although he was freezing cold, it felt like he was sweating. His eyes watered. He wondered, would it hurt? Or would the impact shock his nervous system so much he wouldn't feel the pain? He could see the treetops now. They were coming closer. He could practically feel the surface racing towards him. This was it. He closed his eyes. A crack of something. The sound of an explosion in the distance came from behind him. Wind rushed by him and something snatched him out of the air. His descent ended abruptly, and now he was flying across the landscape instead of towards it at the blinding speed. Dan opened his eyes. The blue creature was holding him and carrying him in its... Oops. What happened? I just saved your life, the creature answered. You should never try flying without wings or magic. Dan just stared back at the thing that had saved him. What are you? I'm Rainbow Dash, fastest flyer there is.